going to finish off the last little section in Mark chapter 12. We're going to be in verses 38 to 44. And in this section, Jesus is going to do a character contrast. He's going to contrast the scribes with an elderly widow. Now, the scribes sort of represent the religious people who care about their external religious performance. They care about how other people see them. And they do prayers and they do religious acts in order to garner praise from men. And he contrasts that with this elderly widow who gives out of her poverty. And nobody sees her contribution. Nobody really notices it, but God notices it. And what Jesus is trying to do, he's trying to shake up the way that we view people, the way that we view status. That status in the kingdom of God is not about the praise of men. It's not about what everybody else sees on the outside, but it's about the inner man. It's about your heart before God. It's about you loving and worshiping and honoring God when no one's looking. And that's really the acid test for us, whether we're doing this Christian thing to please parents, to please other people, to please the spouse, to please whoever, or if we are actually living out of a genuine desire to love and obey Christ. And we're going to see that God's value system is very different than ours, that man sees the outside, but God looks at the heart. So we're going to start in verse 38. And in his teaching, Jesus, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and like greetings in the marketplaces, and have the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." And he sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the offering box. Many rich people put in large sums, and a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. And he called his disciples to him and said to them, "Truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the offering box. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all that she has to live on." Jesus warns his disciples again about these scribes. And he says, you got to watch out for them. They do all these things for the praise of men. They have these long robes that show how exalted they are as religious teachers. They love to meet people in the marketplace, show what kind of a big network that they have. They have the best seats in the synagogues. You know, I remember hearing some Baptist churches, people would pay for their own little seat to sit in the front or something like that. You know, they have this entitlement sense to themselves. And they also love to make long, long prayers. They sound so spiritual, so religious. But Jesus looks right through all of that and says, but they devour the homes of widows. They are wicked men, and they will be condemned. All the world might praise them, but God condemns them because he sees the wickedness of their hearts. God hates that false, pious religion. And he contrasts that with this elderly woman, this woman who's a widow. She goes up to the offering, probably at the temple, and she has very little money. I mean, she gives out of her poverty, Jesus says. She's not funding any capital campaigns. She's not going to be, making low-income housing for people. She's not going to be feeding a family with that money. I mean, really, there's no fanfare to that. No one's going to be impressed by that. In fact, probably people just ignored her, as people often did in those days to widows. But Jesus looks at her and gathers all of his disciples and goes, I want you to watch her. She gave more than everybody else. So to a disciple, you'd be like, what are you talking about? She barely gave a penny. She didn't give much of anything at all. And Jesus goes, you're looking at the outside. You're not seeing the devotion this expresses in her heart. That out of her poverty she gave. That's the generosity of her heart. And that's what God values. God doesn't need our money. I mean, God's not served by human hands. God doesn't need anything from us. But what he loves is how generosity reveals our heart and reveals his work in our hearts. And he goes, that woman right there, she understands what this kingdom is about. She has a humility and a joy and a trust and dependence in God that puts the scribes with all their pretense and all their religious showboating to shame. God sees the heart, man just sees the outside. We're often concerned about our religious external performance, our spiritual activity, and if we're honest, we all have that scribe in us. And it's really hard to actually do things when we don't really feel like we're going to get anything out of it. But it's a challenge to think, okay, who are we before God when no one's watching? Robert Murray McCheyne, a great pastor, one time he said that, this is a paraphrase, but he said that who a man is before God private, in prayer, is who he is and no more. That your inner life with God, that when no one's looking, that shows what your heart's true allegiance is. And I think that's a challenge. Does your life preach a sermon? If anyone can lead a Bible study on this stuff. I mean, it's easy for me to talk about this and wax poetic about it, but I don't know. If you followed me through a day, I don't know if my life would preach a sermon about, humility. I don't know if my prayer life, if you watched me pray, would preach a sermon about dependence. I don't know if you looked at my spending habits necessarily, you would get a sermon about generosity. But that is the challenge. Do your actions, does your life, does what you do, does your integrity, who you are when the cameras are off, when people aren't looking, does that match who you are in other areas of life? Like, are you a consistent person? Is this a heartfelt, genuine obedience, or is it just for the praise of men? I think if some of you are in trials right now, this is one of the great times when God shows you that. He reveals how much of your life is just about the show, just about what you can get out of it. And he purifies your faith. And so some of you in your trials, this is what God is trying to do. He's trying to be like, man, I want you to have a real faith. I want you to see the tested genuineness of your faith. That's what the Apostle Peter talks about. And that's more precious than gold, because you're going to know that you're the real deal. And God looks at you in your trial, no matter how poorly you're handling it, if you're making little bits of progress, if you're pushing forward little by little, day by day, imperfectly, he looks at you and he says, you get it. I can see your heart. You're doing an amazing work, because you're not doing this to get something out of it. You're doing this because you trust me, you love me, and you want to obey me. And that's where genuine faith is often born. When we're stripped of the pretense, stripped of all the sort of superficial things that can come with our faith that we all struggle with, and we're forced to contend with God and to go, man, do I really want to know God? Am I willing for him to strip away the things that are fake and superficial so that I can know God? I think this is a great time to ask that question and to seek an answer.